Since 2012, when this all started, we've had many updates and various papers from government, including the English Apprenticeships, Our 2020 Vision, which was published on the 7th of December 2015. This is probably the paper, I think, that really confirmed the commitment from government, and that commitment being to 3 million apprentices by 2020. It also focused on improving the quality and the promotion of the benefits of apprenticeships, because we realised that generally that there was a need to raise the value of apprenticeships going forward. There's much really that could be discussed about the reforms and all the subsequent changes. However, for the purpose of today, we're going to break them down into the 3 key areas that you can see on your screen now. That is the learning model, the institutions, and the funding. If we take the learning model to start with and focus on the overall outcome a learner is expected to achieve and how, something which I think, regardless of whether we have new standards or the existing SACE, the outcome of the learner is always at the heart of everything we do. We all understand the importance of this learner journey and the learner's experience and how it is central. However, going forward in the new world of apprenticeships, there will be changes to the methodology of both the delivery and assessment. The balance of on-programme and off-programme and the learner-led self-directed learning is changing. Also, there may not always be a regulated qualification that sits within the standard, and this means that the scaffolding of delivering to a qualification may not be there, and therefore a programme of learning based purely on the occupational standards will need to be prepared. And this is something that for a lot of us we're not used to. We're used to having that qualification in the SACE and being able to design our programmes accordingly around the specification. So we're having to learn and think a little bit more, maybe outside the box. The second box looks at really governance and the institutions and stakeholders that are responsible for the recruitment, the delivery of the assessment, certification, and other elements of the programmes. One key part here is that we need to ensure good practice and standardisation of quality and practice across apprenticeships, no matter what level or what sector. It's recently been announced, only in the last couple of weeks, that a provider is required to be approved on the register of apprenticeship training organisations if they wish to deliver the new standards for apprenticeships. This is to encourage standardisation of practice and confirm validity and quality, and we're going to see more of that coming up, and I think it may be something that Gary touches on in his part of the presentation. It's also likely that we will start to see a wider range of providers, including our private training providers, FE colleges, employees, higher education institutions, university technical colleges, even academies going forward. Again, they will all have to meet the criteria to be accepted onto the register in order to deliver apprenticeships. Another major factor is ensuring that we match the learner to the right and most appropriate apprenticeship programme. This is incredibly important in order to support both retention and the successful learner outcome. Therefore, we all need to recruit in a robust way, using a variety of tools, which would include good initial assessment and guidance, other initial assessment tools and diagnostic tools, and unbiased and fair interview opportunities. And you've probably heard of the Digital Apprenticeship Service, which is designed to help you with some of the aspects of this process. But equally, Pearson is here to help you. And I do know that Gary is going to talk a little bit more about DAS, the Digital Apprenticeship Service, later on during this webinar. Still looking at this particular area, we're considering certification. Now, this can only take place on successful completion of the endpoint assessment. And it is the organisation who carries out the endpoint assessment who is responsible for liaising with the appropriate institution to certificate the learner. If the apprenticeship does not include a regulated qualification, there will not be any other certificates. However, if it does, the relevant awarding organisation will certificate as usual. So just to recap, for those apprenticeship standards that have or still maintain a regulated qualification within them, they will still, if the learner is successful, gain that particular qualification, and it will be certificated by the awarding organisation. But the endpoint assessment, which is common to all new apprenticeships going forward, will be certificated by the organisation that undertakes that particular role. And lastly, regarding this point, is the quality assurance of the programme. This includes both on-programme for the delivery and the formative assessment, and also that of the endpoint assessment. The third box refers to funding and how the new regime is going to be funded, and considerations around contributions, the levy or not, depending on size of the business, funding bands, and for the logistics of how this key implication is managed for providers. It's a different world, and we know that the purse has shifted to the employer now, who has the power to negotiate a delivery contract with a provider, or of course deliver themselves if that employer themselves is on the register. We also know that 80% of funding is for the on-programme delivery, with 20% currently being held back until successful EPA, endpoint assessment. So this means a huge change for training providers, and the need to be extra savvy in developing a compelling business proposition and clearly articulating the benefits of their own providers and their USPs in order to win contracts. Again, Gary is going to cover funding in more detail, and there will be a specific session on this topic later in the series. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to be looking at the comparison between the SACE framework and the new standards. The infographic that you can see on the screen aims to clearly identify the key differences between the world of SACE and the new standards. So let's just have a look at SACE first. We're all very familiar with this system, and it's centred around qualifications, as I mentioned earlier, that the learner needs to study. And depending on the framework and the learner needs, and the overall achievement of a prescribed combination of assessments being the indicator that a learner has achieved occupational competence and therefore the full apprenticeship. So we have the competence, we have the knowledge and skills, we have the maths and English, and they're all compartmentalised within SACE, and we know that they have to tick off each part to be successful in achieving their overall apprenticeship. However, going forward, if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the new standard apprenticeships. They too are based on learner outcome, but specifically at occupational mastery through on-programme training. And as I mentioned earlier, not necessarily including a qualification. However, there must be successful completion of the endpoint assessment in order to be successful in gaining the apprenticeship. The endpoint assessment has an agreed format for each occupational standard. It's holistic in nature, and it will be agreed and set at the time of sign-off for the assessment standard. In addition, another thing to consider around EPA, or endpoint assessment, is grading. This will be applied as an extra confirmation of the learner's competence, and the grading, again, will vary according to what the assessment standard has been signed off to be. Moving on to our next slide around implications, because all of these changes, whenever there's changes, there's opportunity, but equally there are a variety of implications. So one of the key differences is moving from formative to summative assessment. As previously mentioned, the learner will need to confirm competence through the endpoint assessment. However, there will still be some element of on-programme assessment, similar to what you've been used to and has been called continuous assessment in the world of SACE. And this will take place during the delivery phase. In addition, there will be a need to focus on practicing for the endpoint assessment, ensuring there are opportunities that the learner is ready for the summative EPA. This will be a key focus to support successful completion. Equally, there will be more specific learning aims. Each new apprenticeship standard is based on a specific occupational standard which has been developed by employers and other key stakeholders in order to meet both industry and labour market needs and of course address the skills gaps. This differs from the SACE framework, which encompass pathways within sectors and less of a direct occupational focus. It was more transitional, there was more opportunity to be able to transfer. So we do have a slight narrowing of focus moving forward onto the occupational standards. If we consider the different types of assessment, just as before, there's that element of on-programme development, as I mentioned. But one thing to remember is that this does not count towards the endpoint assessment. It does allow you to measure the learner's progress during the programme, and combined with formative EPA opportunities will support and prepare your learner for endpoint assessment. The types of endpoint assessment methodology that would have been agreed at the point the standard assessment was approved could be made up of a variety of methodologies, such as multiple choice tests, observations, portfolio, professional discussion. It could be a mixture of some of those. It may be one on its own. But whatever is agreed at the time of assessment standard sign-off will be what that endpoint assessment consists of across the board. Another point to consider is that the learner must be on programme for a minimum of 12 months before the endpoint assessment can be taken. This is sometimes longer depending on the standard. The last point on here is about more providers. Within this new world of apprenticeship standards, it's opened up opportunities for providers to take part in different aspects of the programme, either as a deliverer, quality assurance agency, or the independent endpoint assessment centre. And as I mentioned before, this can be a whole array of deliverers or providers, from private training providers to HEIs, to academies, even schools, and we've started to see interests because from any of these institutions post-16. To carry out delivery, I beg your pardon, any centre again must be registered on the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers to undertake and deliver the programme, or the Register of Assessment Apprenticeship Organisations to be able to deliver endpoint assessment. So there are more hoops that we're required to jump through. Okay, looking at our standards development update, on the screen here you'll see an infographic which is identifying 4 different categories. And our response at Pearson has been to review our existing portfolio of apprenticeships and the needs of employers and the market and identify where we should be focusing, and to actively engage with trailblazer groups on the requirements for new standards, offering our expertise and support to facilitate the development of delivery and assessment. Currently, there are in excess of 150 trailblazer groups in both the development and delivery stages across over 300 new occupational standards. And this number is increasing virtually on a daily basis, and it's anticipated that we could be looking at around 1,800 new occupational standards by 2020, which is a huge increase from the pathways that we're used to through SACE. So I'm going to look at these in order. So if we look at the first slide, I've reversed it. Instead of starting at 1 and moving to 4, I'm going to start with category 4 and 3, which we've referred to as the slow starters. This is where, if we look at category 4 in particular, it's where we expect a standard to be developed based on the popularity of the SACE framework. In the main, at this stage, at category 4, there has been no trailblazer employer group established and no indication that the current SACE framework is due to be turned off. So that's where we're starting, but we are making sure that we are engaging where we know there is movement. For category 3, this is where we know there's been some discussions around forming a trailblazer employer group. However, there may not have been any formal timeline put into place to date. So across both these categories, 4 and 3, there's a mix of both prominent sectors, such as business skills, early years, which are very popular sectors with high numbers of registrations, and also some that are less popular, such as pharmacy and manufacturing. We do know that these will eventually be turned off from the SACE framework and transitioned over to the new standards. However, currently we have no real confirmed indication of the timelines, but we're keeping a watching brief on this. Also, one thing to remember is that the sectors may appear in different categories due to the fact that they could be in category 1, for example, with one occupational standard, and in category 4 for another occupational standard, which is further down the line. So you will see the sectors crop up in different categories going forward. For the second category, we're calling this nearly there. We understand currently that there's around about 130 standards that are still in the development stage. So there may be some changes or some minor delays here, but there is a consensus within the Trailblazer group, which means that we can be fairly confident in predicting that these are moving forward. And the first category here is the most advanced, and where both the standard and assessment plan have been agreed, and the detail, the methodology, the operational aspect of the endpoint assessment is being scoped out. Currently, we have around about 103 Trailblazer groups that have been formed, resulting in 195 standards or thereabout now ready for development. Some of these standards are already in delivery, with first endpoint assessments expected to take place in 2017. Okay, in front of you now, you can see the slide, which is an example of our solution for Customer Service Practitioner standards. And what we've tried to do here, and I won't go through it all for you because I realise time is tight today, but what it aims to do is to give you a complete picture of how we are supporting the different elements of the Customer Service Practitioner standard. And this is what we're planning to do, and indeed are doing, for many of the Trailblazers that we've got up and running already, and we're working towards for some of those going forward. So we're looking to offer bundles. We know that we can offer endpoint assessment services for many of these, and where appropriate, accredited or regulated qualifications to support delivery. So please look out for more of these, and we will be going through specific webinars going forward around our proposition and around our toolkits. And please look out for our new brochure, which should be with you very, very shortly, and will give you far more detail on this. It should be available on our website very soon. And lastly, before I hand over to my colleague, SACE switch-off dates. Okay, so in relation to the transition from SACE, Pearson have actively participated, as I'm sure many of you may have done, in the withdrawal consultations. And today, approximately 210 frameworks are still in existence. That was at the end of July. We've got 53% of frameworks up for consultation of withdrawal for 2016-17, and we've got 47% which are still waiting consultation. And to this date, we had no indication of timelines where this is likely to happen, or the sectors which are likely to be next. The latest consultation we were involved in was July 2016, and was the largest one to date, with 55 frameworks under review for consultation for suggested withdrawal by the SFA in April 2017. So we know so far that of these frameworks that have been under consultation for 2016-17, tend to be those frameworks with low registrations, 0 to 125 over the consultations that have happened to date. So we're waiting for any indication of when the next consultation is likely to occur. We have no idea, but as soon as we know, we will let you know. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Gary Tovey, who's our Stakeholder Relation Manager, and he's going to take you through the rest of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Okay, so just before we hand over to Gary, I'm going to give it 2 minutes just to see whether or not anyone has any questions on the content that they've just seen. If there are no questions, we will proceed. So please use your chat window now if there was something that you wanted to ask us, anything more specific that perhaps Cheryl didn't go into detail on. Okay, so we've got a question come in. Education and training appears in both categories 1 and categories 3 and 4. Which is more accurate of those two, would you say, Cheryl?
Okay, thank you for that question. As I understand, the question's about our occupational standard for education and training. It's certainly not category 4, and I'm not quite sure it's quite category 2 yet. I know that's a bit of a strange answer, but it's sort of somewhere in the middle. We know that there's been a fair bit of activity going on. If you would like to leave your details with us, I can have a conversation with the sector manager for that specific sector and get back to you with some detail because she's closer to it than I am.
Okay, thanks for that, Cheryl. We have a number of very similar questions that have come in, but very similar but different because everyone's asking about their own sector. I suppose we should have predicted that at this point in time. We will find, rather than run through all of these now, we will find a way to give you more specific answers on each of your sectors. So if you want to send in to me, if there's a particular sector of interest, can you just send in a chat question to me and I will make sure that we get specific answers to those sectors after the events or towards the end of the event if we can assemble those offline while Gary's speaking. But rather than turn this into a sector-by-sector rundown, we're going to push on now with Gary's presentation on institutions, funding, and the outlook for development as we move forward, and then we'll pause for another general questions towards the end. So Gary, I'm going to hand over control to you now. Bear with us, everyone, for 2 seconds while we just hand over the change.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you, Cheryl. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to take you through some additional information, really, as Cheryl kind of framed it, really. The institutions, how the funding is starting to look, etc., which will, of course, underpin the delivery of the new apprenticeship standards. So I will start with institutions, and hopefully the slides are working for you. I'll just do a quick check to check that the slides have moved forward. Yeah, thank you, Neil. Okay, so if I start by just giving you a little bit more detail about the Institute for Apprenticeships, hopefully you're aware that the Institute is going to be in place from April 2017, and I think it's fair to say that the setup of the Institute is happening relatively slowly and very much in the background. And it really won't be a force until April 2017 or overly visible, although I'll share some of the information we have so far. The Institute will be independent from what was the BIS DFE Joint Apprenticeship Unit, now just of course the DFE unit, following the changes we've had over the last couple of months, chaired and led by employers, and that process, that recruitment process, is currently underway to recruit that board, etc. There is also a process occurring at the moment to choose the leadership of the Institute for Apprenticeships, and again, visibility of that hasn't really come through as yet. So the Institute will be in place to perform a number of different roles and to govern primarily from April everything really, I suppose, to do with the reform that has happened thus far and is planned beyond April, and certainly to meet the government's 2020 vision, which of course includes the delivery of 3 million apprenticeship starts by 2020. The structure is quite challenging to understand currently. We expect that the structure and the resourcing of the IFA will come predominantly from existing organisations who will move across, for example, from the DFE, from the Skills Funding Agency, and potentially from another couple of organisations that may see their remit either change or cease under the current SACE framework model as well. As I say, they are taking a laid-back and cautious approach up till April, and the formation of the IFA is very much in shadow or parallel to the ongoing reform managed by DFE, and it is primarily ex-BIS people now in DFE who are performing that shadow setup process. However, we do understand that the IFA will be publishing a draft strategy document in October, which will give us more information and indication of how they feel their apprenticeship role will be performed, and I stress that purposely because I will come on in a moment to his expanded role under the Sainsbury review, but absolutely their setup at the moment is focusing on April and what they will do for apprenticeships. Also, it's probably worth noting that the IFA will perform a one-body role, and that does lead to obviously a number of questions that cannot be answered currently around where does the current regulator sit, where does Ofqual sit, where does the FIS sit, etc. But I think the IFA is very clear, and I would expect to see this in its draft October strategy, that it will be absolutely the guardian of apprenticeships and will absolutely drive what that looks like in the future. So what do we know about the IFA's role thus far? We know that they will be the body that will take over the process of standards in development, and by that I mean everything from employers and employer groups coming together and completing the expressions of interest to develop new apprenticeship standards. They will also perform the role of sign-off. It is anticipated that the involvement of the Minister will be relaxed or removed entirely because there will be that governance there through an employer-led body to be able to sign that off and make sure the standards to be developed are appropriate. And right to the other end of the process, they will also be signing standards off as ready for delivery. They will take that from the Joint Apprenticeship Unit. They will also, and has always been very clear actually, that the IFA's role is cemented in the role of looking at the quality of new apprenticeships and apprenticeships ongoing as standards become very much more business as usual. Again, I just highlight that that does lead to some questions around existing quality assurance regulators, etc., for example, Ofqual. But you may be aware that Ofqual themselves have recently published a paper stating that they are happy to support endpoint assessment so long as the organisations delivering that endpoint assessment meets their general conditions of recognition, i.e. the same conditions that current awarding organisations have to meet. Whether that will lead to new organisations meeting those conditions, i.e. becoming awarding organisations, I think it is a wait and see. But again, April 2017 and beyond may see a difference in direction of travel on that, depending on the Institute's own take on things. They will also be responsible for certification, and by this I mean the overarching apprenticeship certificate. That of course leads a question to the current role of FIS, who currently issue certificates on behalf of SSCs and SSBs. But again, under this notion of one body, the IFA is absolutely expecting to take on that role. They will also be reviewing standards. That is something that was very clearly articulated by Lord Sainsbury in his report and in the subsequent post-16 skills plan. Again, our feeling is that that review of standards will be very much on a business as usual and steady state, rather than a pull everything that has been developed thus far and review it. It's always been quite clear that standards developed by employer groups would be reviewed on a 3 to 4 year cycle, and from meeting with the IFA, they have given us the impression that they will start to implement that from April. That actually makes good sense because by the time the IFA comes into existence fully, some of the initial Phase 1 Trailblazer standards will be 3 to 4 years old, and it probably is the most sensible time to start looking at that as well. Again, how they will do that, we would expect more detail in October.
Thanks for that, Gary. There was just one question that came in, which which was to clarify, will the IFA replace ACE for certification? Just 2 seconds.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, great question. Yes, apologies. It's me and my million acronyms. So the Apprenticeship Certification England ACE system is currently managed by FIS. Please don't ask me to remember what all the S's mean, but the Federation. I think, you know, in terms of FIS and ACE, we wait to see what their role will be moving forward. But I think the IFA has clearly put its stall out to say they intend to do apprenticeship certification. Whether that means they simply pick up the ACE system remains to be seen. At the moment, it's more a question around which organisation will deal with that rather than anything else. Thanks, Neil. Just a final slide really on the IFA. More unknowns, but clearly in the Sainsbury review published in July 2016 and in the subsequent government response to the post-16 skills plan, the IFA will have an expanded role to also cover technical and professional education. There's no actual clear date on when that is likely to happen, but the Institute will at some point morph into something akin to the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. They will continue their role that they will be starting in April 2017 for apprenticeships, but they will take on a larger role from the DfE, who are currently managing the implementation of the post-16 skills plan. They will take on a greater role because there is a lot of parity between the two systems and what Lord Sainsbury recommended. It is also increasingly likely that that things like funding, which again is currently being managed by BIS DfE or DfE, and the Digital Apprenticeship Service currently being managed by the SFA, under this one organisational ambition, that other parts of the system and the reform are likely to come under the IFA as well, and I could probably list others, to be honest. So that's just an overview of the IFA. October is probably our key date, just to stress that. If they deliver that on time, hopefully they will, because actually from meeting them they are squirreling away in DfE on that. But we really won't get to understand the nature of the beast until April 2017. Which moves on to the Digital Apprenticeship Service, which is going to be the IT solution that will manage levy payments and funding drawdowns. It will be available to levy payers initially in April 2017, so that 2% of large employers will be paying the levy, and will be available to small and medium enterprises at a later date as well. So we've got some time until it's due to launch, and the SFA is starting to release beta mode versions of that. So if you are able to take a look at that, obviously we'd encourage you to do that. It's, you know, in terms of this being an IT system, it's pretty huge actually, and I think the image on the right probably demonstrates it very well. So well done to Neil for that. It will handle around £2 billion worth of transactions per year. That's around 3 million individual apprentices by 2020, as we know from the government target. And I think it's a really good comparison here, actually, in terms of comparable government websites. You've got the digital self-assessment, which many of us are probably lucky or unlucky enough to have to use. That has about 5 million users, and the personal tax account has 2 million users there as well. Again, visibility is fairly sketchy of the Digital Apprenticeship Service. Certainly the screenshots I've seen aren't particularly inspirational, but that's because they sit on the .gov.uk website and so have that standard look and feel. But I think the important thing around that is it will be that one-stop shop initially for the levy payers to be able to spend their levy pot, to see what's in their levy pot, and to start to procure services for either on-program or endpoint assessment as well. And it will become the IT system that all of us involved with the delivery of apprenticeship, irrespective of what part that is, are most likely to be interacting with moving forward as well. Now, government IT system always scares the life out of many people hearing that. I would say that on paper they seem to be taking quite a sensible approach to this. It's not going to be a big bang in April 2017, demonstrated by the fact that it's not going to be available to all. But equally, the team at the SFA have been very clear that from day one it will not have full functionality, and that additional functionality will come online over a prolonged timescale to ensure that it isn't big bang, and therefore big bang in terms of also big bang broken. So it will be a phased approach to its full functionality over a period of time. So just to move on to funding, and I will just echo what Cheryl said in terms of we have a separate webinar. It will be the 4th in our series, currently scheduled for the 4th of October, with my colleague Sian Owen, who focuses very heavily on funding and what it means for our customers, for employers, etc. But as Cheryl outlined in the first slide, looking at the overall Richard review, funding is an absolutely critical part of the reforms that we are still in the midst of. Key to that is that funding will be channelled to the employer and not the provider, with some exception, i.e. maths and English, which I'll come on to in a moment. Large employers will self-fund through the levy mechanism, which begins in April 2017, and we had further information on published on the 12th of August this year. And small employers will receive increased support, but critically, employer contribution will be mandatory, irrespective really of the size of organisation, although again there are exceptions depending on the age and profile of particular apprentices. So a bit like the previous slide around SACE versus standards, this gives a little bit of an indication of where funding is looking slightly differently, but this is also looking at the fact that we have frameworks still in play and we already have standards as well. As I mentioned, real key information came out on the 12th of August, which details the funding for levy payers and non-levy payers. We have a pilot scheme in place for standards at the moment, which actually ends very soon, which is the 33% mandatory cash contribution. Many of you may have heard of that, of the 2-for-1 government versus employer contribution, and we have the ongoing framework funding as is currently as well. What you'll see from April 2017, which is again theme here. April 2017 is a kind of critical tipping point in terms of funding as well. Levy contributions will go into DAS collected from HMRC, and they will then appear in DAS, and levy payers will start to use their levy funds to pay for not only new standards but also frameworks if they haven't been withdrawn by that point as well. There will be 15 funding caps which are currently out for consultation and were included in that 12th of August information, and they will be applied to both existing frameworks and new standards as well, so that levy payers can clearly see what they will need to pay dependent on the size and breadth of that framework or standard as well. That will all be channeled through DAS for levy payers in terms of the mechanism of them being able to use that online bank account effectively. Non-levy payers, we're expecting their funding rules and methodologies probably actually more towards September. The employer contribution there will actually be around 10%, again will be mandatory, with government topping that up obviously with a 90% funding. If you are a small employer, i.e. with less than 50 employees, you would not have to pay anything towards the cost of training of a 16 to 18-year-old because there will be specific funding for that, and that was detailed again in the information recently released. Unlike the levy payers, the non-levy payers will continue to contract with the Skills Funding Agency until such time that the DAS becomes available for them. I mentioned on the previous slide that generally speaking, funding will be channeled through the employers. The only exception for that generally will be £471 funding for English and Maths qualifications, which is the same as now, and that will go directly to the provider or to an employer who has decided to become a provider themselves. Because one of the other critical pieces of information that came out this month was also the proposals for a new register of apprenticeship training providers, which is different to the register of training providers, whereby both employers, private training providers and colleges can elect to sign up to that and go through the due diligence to become a registered apprenticeship training provider. That has a lot of positives and potentially unknown consequences, particularly for employers who may not be used to operating in that space. But again, you know, it broadens the opportunity for those as well. So as I say, a lot of detail in there around funding. I am not going to say I'm any expert by a mile, but please do join us. It will be me and myself, and Sian on the 4th of October. So we will have a lot more detail in there. That whole webinar is dedicated to that as well.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Just to emphasise to a couple of people who have sent in questions or who were wondering about endpoint assessment and expected qualifications needed for assessors and when more detail and clarity around those will be provided. We have got another event coming up on the 20th of September when we're going to go into a bit more detail on all of those issues and on standard by standard development updates. So you may not get that information today, but it is coming. So I'll just hand back, unless there are any further questions, I'll just hand back to Gary.
Thank you very much, Neil. So just a few more slides from me, and then obviously we've got hopefully a few minutes to just capture any more and respond to questions. So I've gone into quite a deep dive there around institutions, governance, funding. Obviously more to come because an hour's webinar would never do that justice, as the same for Cheryl's slides as well. But just to put this all into a little bit of context in terms of the outlook. And particularly around the political outlook and how that can, could have an impact on all of this going forward, or may not. But I think it will certainly make. I think Whitehall and Westminster are looking at, because of the changes that we've had, are looking at all of this very closely. And also, apprenticeships are still absolutely there on the agenda for this government. and this Parliament, and even more so now that they've got less time to deliver that 2020 vision. So we had a previous management team in terms of education skills in Nicky Morgan, Nick Bowles, etc. We do have a new management that is, you know, still finding its feet. We have Justine Greening as the Secretary of State for Education now, reporting, of course, into our new Prime Minister, which again we have to remember has happened. And you know, Theresa May will have views on apprenticeships, as she will on technical and professional education as well. And there's our man, Robert Halfon, the new Minister of State for Skills, a man that, according to his biography, you will know is passionate about apprenticeships, employed the first apprentices in Parliament, etc. And he is, you know, starting to review what his predecessor was doing. There was the delay in that levy information until this month, and I think that all links back to him making sure that he can hold his head high, that these reforms will continue. No doubt, however, he'll want to put his own stamp on it. There is obviously the wider context of the result of the UK referendum, how that will distract government in terms of you know, where apprenticeships are in terms of priority, how the effect that will have on business confidence and investment, the effect that may then have on employers' ability or willingness to engage, bearing in mind the reforms continue to be employer-centric as well. We wait to hear on Theresa May's views on industrial and trade strategy and how that dovetails into apprenticeship and technical and professional education, and how apprenticeships can support that industrial and trade strategy. It may be similar to her predecessor. It may have some slightly different viewpoints, I imagine. And of course, the new Chancellor's attitude to the economy, rejuvenation and growth, greater focus on investments. We hope that apprenticeships are absolutely core to that, or certainly education and skills. And we'll be looking to the IFA, and to DfE, and of course to the new Skills Minister to really give us some clarity on that. One other thing to consider is obviously the what happens in the negotiations, not just around trade but also free movement, and what that might mean for the future skills needs and skills gaps in the UK as well. I think you can see this as an opportunity in equal measure to anything else really, that, you know, high skills and a skilled workforce will be required in a new look UK outside of the EU, and hopefully all of you on the call today will recognise that apprenticeships are probably, you know, one of the main ways in which we can continue to do that as well. But we as I say, we mention this kind of broader outlook because, you know, it is important to know what's coming on the horizon and what other impacts in the kind of geopolitical sphere could have on the reforms as well. We do have 3 reviews into apprenticeships, which is always interesting as well, because they will influence Robert Halfon, for example, and other colleagues in DfE. We have a National Audit Office report due out, it should be any day to be fair. They've been looking at the value for money and return of investment of apprenticeships pretty much at the same time, so as the Cabinet Committee and also the Public Accounts Committee. I think the fact that there's 3 very similar inquiries, reviews, whatever you want to call them, happening, again demonstrates the importance of apprenticeships to this Parliament and government, but also shows the nervousness around making sure they've got their metrics right and they're actually seeing that as well. Results will determine the levy rollout, or the levy will happen, but I think those results could help shift, particularly before the next batch of information in October, where the projected funding rates, etc., will be firmed up. You know, the government will, of course, use its own intelligence and research to support that view, alongside the consultation that is currently open on all of that information that came out in August, which closes in the first week of September as well. And with that, I shall hand over to Neil for Cheryl and I to take any additional questions. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you very much, Gary. So, if anybody has any questions for Gary and Cheryl, please send them in through the chat window. We'll stay online for a few minutes to answer your questions. We do have a couple of Outlook things to keep your eyes out for as well, which I'll run you through quickly. So while we're waiting for questions, let me just take back control because there's something else that I would like to tell you about. So that is our next event. New standards, new delivery challenges. We're going to run that one on Monday the 6th of September. So that is now incorrect. It is Monday the 20th of September. I'm not quite sure how that one slipped past me when I was preparing these slides. It's the 20th of September. We will make the recording of that event available after the day, and that will be available to all of you. The event is currently now booked up, but we'll make sure that you will get the content for that because it's booked up in record time, and we recognise from that the keenness of finding out about this information. Another question that's just come into me about future webinars. One was mentioned in October. When is this? And we'll be sending out invitations to join this. Michelle, that was from Michelle Page. Michelle, yes, that's, I think you're referring to our funding one. I will drop the link to the page where you can sign up to that onto the chat window in just a moment. And Gay Bogan, yes, you are quite correct. The 20th of September is a Tuesday. I can't quite understand how I managed to miss the date of the event on that last slide that I've got on your screen. Apologies for that. And also got a question from Susan Hunter, which recaps a generalised theme of these events, which is, can there be more places on these webinars or more dates available? Susan, we're actually limited by the technology to a certain number of users on this webinar. We're on the biggest plan available for this software, and it won't let us sign up any people, sign up any more people than that limit. What I will do is I'm going to start to institute something where I send around a request to people to cancel if they're not intending to turn up. That then frees up and allows me to offer the events to a waiting list. So the process will get a bit better, and hopefully more people who can actually turn up on the day will be able to get into the event. Okay, so just a few more things coming on the chat window, not so much related to the content of this event, but relating to processes. So just a couple of things that I wanted to bring to your attention. On the slides when they're sent out, you're going to find some links here to our Twitter page, to a LinkedIn group, to the Insight newsletter, to subscribe to that, to a new blog that we've only just started on the Pearson UK site. There's only one post on there currently, but there will be lots more coming, and also a link to where you can book onto future Insight webinars. If you want to be the first to know about the events, as I say, places are limited on the live events. We can't go over a certain number of attendees. Sign up to one of these, follow one of these, one of your choice, and there you will find the information that you're looking for, and you will be the first to know. And finally, I've been asked once again, are the webinars being recorded and shared online at Pearson or another link? Yes, they have been recorded. They will be shared on the qualifications website in the new apprenticeships section, and I will circulate that link to everyone who's registered and attended the events up until this point. So I'd just like to finish off, if I may. We will stay online for further questions, but I'd just like to finish off, if I may, by handing over to someone who's not in the room, and that's actually Leslie Davis. And this video seemed pertinent to me because it covers some of the themes that we're going into at the next event on the 20th of September, not the 6th, as advertised in the slides just now, on the 20th of September, where she talks about the kind of challenges that we're going to face as an awarding organisation and as an education sector over the next year or so as we get ready to deliver new apprenticeships. So I'll hand over to Leslie now, metaphorically, but we will stay on the line. Keep sending in any further questions if you have them, but thank you very much for attending the event, and over to you, Leslie. And I'm told that you actually can't hear Leslie there. So what I will do is I will send the link to this video into the chat window. And there she makes her points as eloquently as someone of that experience would do. So ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you very much for attending our first Insight webinar for apprenticeships today. Thank you for bearing with us through the minor technical difficulties as the software behaved slightly differently than we expected it to, and as indeed it had behaved in our rehearsal. We're going to stay on the line. If there's anything else that you would like to ask us, we will be here for another few minutes. Thank you very much for attending, and have a very pleasant and hopefully very sunny evening. Okay, everyone, we've dropped down to just a few people remaining on the call, so I'm going to log that off now. and stop the training. It just remains to say, if you're still on the line and still listening to me, thank you very much for attending today, and we hope to see you virtually at another webinar soon.